Hey there. Tonight, we are going to travel together through the mists of time, back to a world where stone pyramids touched the clouds and people looked into mirrors made of volcanic glass to see beyond the veil of everyday life. This is a story about Obsidian, a stone born from fire and earth, polished until it gleamed like frozen water under moonlight. This is a story about the ancient people of Mesoamerica who held these dark mirrors in their hands and believed they could glimpse the future, speak with gods, and understand the mysteries that lay hidden in shadows. It is a story that moves slowly, like smoke rising from copal incense, like the careful steps of a priest climbing temple stairs at dawn. There is no rush here, only the gentle unfolding of something beautiful and strange, something that reminds us how people have always searched for meaning in the darkness, hoping to find light. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back with me to a time when mirrors were not just for seeing your own face, but for seeing everything beyond it. Chapter 1: The Birth of Black Glass. Long before there were cities with names we recognize, before there were empires that stretched across mountains and jungles, there was the earth itself, breathing and shifting beneath the feet of those who walked upon it. In the lands we now call Mexico and Central America, the ground was restless with volcanic fire. Mountains rose up suddenly, their peaks glowing red in the night, sending rivers of molten rock flowing down their sides like thick, burning honey. When this lava met the air, cooling quickly under open sky, it sometimes transformed into something remarkable. It became obsidian, a natural glass, sharp as any blade ever made, black as midnight without stars, smooth as water frozen in time. The people who lived in these lands thousands of years ago discovered this strange stone and recognized immediately that it was special. It was not like other rocks. It did not crumble or break in ordinary ways. Instead, it fractured into edges so fine they could cut through hide and flesh with barely any pressure. It reflected light in a way that seemed almost alive, as if the stone itself held some secret knowledge, some ancient memory of the fire from which it was born. The earliest people to work with obsidian were hunters and gatherers, moving through valleys and forests in small groups, following game animals and seasonal plants. They learned to strike the obsidian carefully, using other stones or pieces of antler, and when they did, flakes would peel away, leaving behind blades and points of extraordinary sharpness. These tools changed everything. Suddenly, hunting became more efficient. Preparing food became easier. The obsidian blade did not just cut, it sliced cleanly, almost magically. But even in those early days, people must have noticed something else about this stone. When they looked into a freshly broken surface of obsidian, they could see their own faces reflected back, dark and wavering, as if they were looking into deep water at twilight. This was the beginning of something profound, though it would take many generations before the full spiritual significance of obsidian mirrors would be understood. As centuries passed and the people of Mesoamerica began to settle in one place, building villages and eventually great cities, their relationship with obsidian deepened. They learned where the best sources of this volcanic glass could be found, high in the mountains, in places where the earth had split open and spilled its molten heart across the landscape. They developed trade routes to bring obsidian from these distant quarries to the growing population centers. Obsidian became valuable, a measure of wealth and power. Those who controlled the sources of obsidian or the trade routes that carried it could become rich and influential. But even as obsidian became an economic resource, it never lost its spiritual dimension. People continued to see something otherworldly in its black, reflective surface, something that went beyond mere utility or beauty. They began to polish it deliberately, rubbing the stone with sand and water for hours, days, weeks, until it became smooth and mirror-like, until you could see not just a vague reflection but a clear image, sharp and detailed, staring back at you from the depths of the stone. Chapter 2: The Olmec and the First Sacred Mirrors. The Olmec people emerged along the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico around 3,000 years ago, building the first great civilization of Mesoamerica. They carved enormous stone heads from basalt, weighing many tons, with broad faces and distinctive helmets. They built ceremonial centers with earthen pyramids and plazas, where people gathered for rituals and celebrations. The Olmec were artists and innovators, creating a style that would influence all the cultures that came after them. Among their many achievements was the refinement of obsidian mirror making. The Olmec took the natural reflective quality of obsidian and perfected it, creating mirrors that were not rough or uneven but smooth and polished to a high shine. These were not large mirrors, not the kind you might hang on a wall. They were often small, round or oval, sometimes no bigger than the palm of a hand, carefully shaped and polished until they gleamed like dark water under a full moon. What did the Olmec do with these mirrors? The answer lies in burial sites and offerings that archaeologists have uncovered centuries later. Mirrors have been found placed on the chests of important people, positioned over the heart, as if to protect or accompany the soul on its journey after death. They have been found in caches of ritual objects, buried beneath temple floors or hidden in caves, alongside jade beads, carved figurines, and other precious items. This tells us that mirrors were not everyday objects. They were sacred, imbued with spiritual power, treated with reverence and care. The Olmec believed, as did the cultures that followed them, that mirrors were portals. They were thresholds between this world and other realms, places where the living could communicate with ancestors, with gods, with forces that existed beyond the reach of ordinary sight. To look into an obsidian mirror was not simply to see your own face. It was to peer into darkness and wait for something to peer back. The Olmec priests and shamans, those individuals chosen or trained to mediate between the human world and the spirit world, used these mirrors in their rituals. We can imagine them in the dim light of a temple or a cave, surrounded by the smell of burning copal resin, the flickering shadows cast by torches or small fires. The priest would hold the mirror, gazing into its black surface, letting his eyes relax and his mind drift into a state of heightened awareness. In this state, shapes might begin to form in the darkness of the obsidian. Faces, perhaps, symbols, visions of things to come or messages from beings that dwelt in other dimensions. The mirror was a tool for divination, a way to ask questions of the universe and receive answers, though the answers were rarely clear or direct. They came in images and feelings, in intuitions that had to be interpreted and understood through layers of symbolism and cultural knowledge.
The Olmec influence spread across Mesoamerica, carried by trade, by migration, by the power of their ideas and artistic vision. When their cities eventually declined and were abandoned, the traditions they had established did not disappear. Instead, they were absorbed and transformed by the people who came after them. The sacred use of obsidian mirrors, the belief in their power to reveal hidden truths, continued to grow and evolve, becoming more elaborate and more deeply woven into the fabric of Mesoamerican religious life. The mirror became a symbol of authority and wisdom, a tool of the gods themselves, and its presence could be felt in every major culture that rose to power in the region. Chapter 3: The Maya and the Vision Serpent. In the dense jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, in the highlands of Guatemala, and across the lowlands that stretch between, the Maya people built one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world ever knew. They were astronomers, mathematicians, architects, and artists. They developed a complex writing system, one of the very few fully developed scripts in the pre-Columbian Americas. They built towering pyramids that aligned with the movements of stars and planets, tracking time with precision that still astonishes scholars today. And at the heart of Maya religion, woven into the rituals performed by kings and priests, was the obsidian mirror, a tool for seeing what could not be seen with ordinary eyes. The Maya believed that the universe was layered, consisting of multiple levels stacked above and below the world of the living. There was the sky, divided into 13 layers, each inhabited by different gods and celestial beings. There was the underworld, called Xibalba, a place of darkness and trials, ruled by death gods who delighted in tormenting souls. And there was the middle world, the earth where humans lived, a place that was constantly influenced by the realms above and below. To communicate with these other realms, to receive guidance from ancestors or gods, the Maya performed elaborate rituals that often involved bloodletting, fasting, and the use of sacred objects. Among the most important of these objects were mirrors made of polished obsidian, or sometimes of polished pyrite, another reflective stone. The Maya called upon what they described as the vision serpent, a supernatural being that emerged during rituals to carry messages between the worlds. When a ruler or a priest let blood, collecting it on paper or cloth which was then burned, the smoke would rise and transform into the serpent, a creature that was part of this world and part of the spirit realm. The serpent's body would coil through the air, and from its open jaws would emerge the faces or forms of ancestors or gods, coming to deliver prophecies or to witness important events. The obsidian mirror was often part of this ritual complex. It was held or placed nearby, its dark surface acting as another kind of portal, another way for visions to manifest. The priest or ruler would gaze into the mirror while in a trance state, sometimes induced by fasting, sometimes by the pain of bloodletting, sometimes by consuming sacred plants or mushrooms that altered consciousness. In that state, the boundary between self and other became thin, and the mirror became a window. Maya art frequently shows rulers and gods wearing or holding mirrors. On carved stone monuments called stelae, we see kings dressed in elaborate costumes, their headdresses towering above them, and on their foreheads or chests, there are circular objects that scholars believe represent mirrors. Sometimes these mirrors are shown with the face of a god peering out from within them, emphasizing that the mirror is not just a reflection but a living presence. The Maya god Tezcatlipoca, whose name means smoking mirror, was particularly associated with obsidian mirrors, though he was more prominent in the cultures to the west. For the Maya, mirrors were associated with multiple deities and with the concept of vision itself, both literal and spiritual. To see clearly, to understand the patterns of fate and the will of the gods, one needed the mirror. Without it, the world remained mysterious and dangerous, full of unseen threats and missed opportunities. The Maya also understood that mirrors could be dangerous. They were not toys or decorations. They were powerful tools that had to be handled with respect and caution. Looking into a mirror without proper preparation or without the guidance of someone trained in its use could be harmful. You might see things that would disturb your mind or attract the attention of malevolent spirits. The mirror could show you your own death or reveal truths about yourself that you were not ready to face. This understanding of the mirror as both helpful and perilous gave it a special place in Maya thought, making it a symbol of the sacred knowledge that was necessary for leadership, but that also carried great responsibility. Chapter 4. The Aztec and the Smoking Mirror God. By the time the Aztec people came to dominate the Valley of Mexico in the 14th and 15th centuries, the tradition of obsidian mirror use was already ancient, stretching back through the Maya, the Olmec, and countless other cultures whose names have been lost to time. The Aztec, who called themselves the Mexica, built their capital city of Tenochtitlan on an island in the middle of a lake, constructing causeways and canals, raising temples that rose like mountains toward the sky. They were warriors and traders, poets and philosophers, and their religion was a complex tapestry of beliefs inherited from the people who had come before them and woven together into something unique. At the center of much Aztec religious thought was a god named Tezcatlipoca, the Lord of the Smoking Mirror, and his very name tells us how important the obsidian mirror was to their understanding of the divine. Tezcatlipoca was one of the most powerful and enigmatic gods in the Aztec pantheon. He was associated with the night sky, with jaguars, with sorcery and warfare, with fate and fortune. He was a god who could give and take away, who could raise a person to great heights or cast them down into ruin without warning. He was often depicted with a smoking obsidian mirror in place of one of his feet, which had been torn off in the creation of the world, and he carried another mirror on his chest or head. This mirror was not merely an attribute or decoration. It was his essence, his way of seeing into the hearts of humans, of knowing their thoughts and intentions. The smoking mirror represented the idea that the future was never fully clear, always obscured by mists and shadows, visible only in fragments and glimpses. Tezcatlipoca could look into his mirror and see everything, past and present and future, but he revealed only what he chose to reveal, often in ways that were cryptic or misleading. For the Aztec priests and diviners, the obsidian mirror was an indispensable tool. Divination was woven into every aspect of Aztec life. Before making important decisions, before going to war, before planting or harvesting, People consulted diviners to learn what the gods thought, to discover whether the timing was auspicious or dangerous. There were many methods of divination in Aztec culture. Some involved casting grains of maize and reading the patterns they made. Others involved interpreting the flight of birds or the behavior of animals. But scrying with an obsidian mirror was considered one of the most powerful and direct methods. The diviner would prepare carefully, fasting and purifying themselves, praying to the appropriate gods, making offerings of incense and flowers. Then, in a quiet, darkened space, they would gaze into the polished surface of the mirror, waiting for visions to appear. What did they see? According to the accounts written down after the Spanish conquest, when Aztec informants described their traditions to European priests, the diviners saw many things. They saw images of people, sometimes recognizable, sometimes strange and unknown. They saw landscapes, battles, floods, fires. They saw symbols that had to be interpreted according to traditional knowledge passed down through generations. The visions were not like watching a clear, moving picture. They were more like looking into deep water and seeing shapes move beneath the surface, or like watching smoke curl and twist and momentarily form images before dissolving again. The skill of the diviner lay not just in seeing, but in understanding, in placing the visions within the context of the question being asked and the larger patterns of cosmic time and divine will. The Aztec also used mirrors in other ways. Warriors sometimes wore small mirrors attached to their clothing or headdresses, believing that the mirrors would reflect back any curses or evil magic sent against them. Mirrors were placed in temples and shrines, positioned so that they could capture and reflect the light of the sun or the moon at certain times of the year, marking important moments in the calendar. When important people died, mirrors were sometimes placed in their tombs, just as the Olmec had done centuries before, ensuring that the deceased would have the tools they needed to navigate the underworld and to see their way through the darkness that awaited all souls after death. Chapter 5: The Creation and Craft of the Mirror. Making an obsidian mirror was not a simple task. It required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of the stone itself. Obsidian is volcanic glass, formed when lava cools so rapidly that crystals do not have time to form. This gives it a smooth, uniform structure, but it also makes it brittle. Strike it wrong, and it will shatter into pieces. Work it too aggressively, and it will develop cracks that ruin the mirror. The craftspeople who made these mirrors were specialists, trained from a young age in the techniques that had been refined over centuries. They were more than artisans. They were participants in a sacred tradition, creating objects that would be used to communicate with gods and spirits. Their work was both technical and spiritual, requiring not just skill with their hands, but also a reverent attitude toward the material and the purpose for which it was intended. The process began with selecting the right piece of obsidian. Not all obsidian was suitable for mirror making. The craftsperson needed a piece that was free of inclusions, without bubbles or impurities that would mar the reflective surface. The obsidian also needed to be the right thickness and size, large enough to create a useful mirror, but not so large that it became too heavy or difficult to work. Once a suitable piece was selected, the craftsperson would begin to shape it, using stone tools to carefully flake away material until the obsidian took on the desired form. This was delicate work. Each strike had to be precise, each flake removed in just the right way to avoid fracturing the entire piece. It could take days just to achieve the basic shape. After shaping, the real work began: polishing. This was the longest and most labor-intensive part of the process. The craftsperson would use a series of abrasives, starting with coarser materials and gradually moving to finer and finer ones. They might use sand mixed with water, rubbing the obsidian in circular motions, hour after hour, day after day. The surface had to be worn down evenly, smoothed until all the tiny irregularities left by the initial shaping were erased. As the surface became smoother, the craftsperson would switch to finer abrasives, perhaps powdered stone or even plant material mixed with water to create a gentle paste. They would continue rubbing, checking the surface constantly, looking for scratches or dull spots, working those areas until they matched the rest. The process was meditative, repetitive, requiring focus and patience. There were no shortcuts. The mirror would only become truly reflective when every part of the surface was perfectly smooth and even. In the final stages of polishing, the obsidian began to transform. What had been a rough, dull stone became something else, something that seemed to hold light within itself. The surface turned glossy, almost liquid in appearance, and when you looked into it, you could see her face reflected back with startling clarity. The craftsperson knew when the mirror was finished not just by looking but by feeling, by running their fingers gently across the surface and sensing that it had reached the perfect degree of smoothness. At that point, the mirror was ready, but it was not yet complete. It needed to be consecrated, blessed by priests, offered to the gods, so that it would be suitable for sacred use. The physical creation of the mirror was only the first step. The spiritual activation of the mirror was equally important, and this was something only those trained in the religious traditions could perform. Chapter 6: Rituals of Consecration and Preparation. Before an obsidian mirror could be used for scrying or divination, it had to be prepared through ritual. This preparation was not optional or merely symbolic. The people of ancient Mesoamerica understood that objects could hold power, that they could be alive in a sense, capable of acting as channels between different realms of existence. A freshly made mirror was like a newborn, present in the world but not yet fully connected to the spiritual forces that would make it effective. The consecration ritual was designed to awaken the mirror, to establish its identity and purpose, to invite the gods and spirits to recognize it and work through it. The details of these rituals varied between cultures and over time, but there were common elements that appeared again and again. The ritual would typically take place in a sacred space, either within a temple or at a natural site considered holy, such as a cave or a mountaintop. The priest or shaman conducting the ritual would have prepared themselves through fasting, abstaining from certain foods and from sexual activity for a prescribed period of time, sometimes several days. This purification was necessary to make the priest worthy of approaching the sacred, to clear away the mundane concerns and distractions of everyday life so that they could focus entirely on the spiritual task at hand. The mirror itself would be cleansed, often washed with water or wiped with leaves from a sacred plant. Then it would be presented to the gods through offerings. Copal incense would be burned, its thick, fragrant smoke rising and surrounding the mirror, carrying prayers and intentions up to the heavens. Flowers might be laid around the mirror, bright petals of marigold or other blooms that were associated with the divine. Food and drink might be offered as well, tiny portions of tamales or tortillas, a small cup of pulque or chocolate, sustenance for the spirits who were being invited to inhabit or work through the mirror. The priest would speak prayers, invoking the names of gods and ancestors, asking for their blessing and their presence, explaining the purpose for which the mirror was being prepared. In some traditions, blood was offered to the mirror. This was not done lightly or casually. Blood was considered the most precious substance, the essence of life itself, and to offer it was to give a part of oneself to the gods, to create a bond that could not be broken. The priest might pierce their tongue, their earlobe, or their finger with a sharp spine or blade, letting drops of blood fall onto the mirror's surface or onto the offerings surrounding it. This act of sacrifice demonstrated sincerity and commitment, showing the gods that the priest was serious, that this was not a trivial request, but a matter of great importance. The blood also served to feed the mirror, to give it vitality, to help it become a living tool rather than an inert object. After the offerings and prayers, the priest would often spend time with the mirror, gazing into it, meditating, allowing the first visions or impressions to come. This initial scrying session was a way to test the mirror, to see if the consecration had been successful, to establish a relationship with whatever spirits or forces were now associated with it. If the priest saw clear visions, felt a strong presence, sensed that the mirror was responsive and powerful, then the consecration was considered successful. If not, if the mirror remained dark and unresponsive, then additional rituals might be needed, or it might be determined that the mirror was not suitable for sacred use and should be kept for other purposes. The relationship between a diviner and their mirror was personal and unique, built over time through repeated use and deepening trust. Chapter 7: The Practice of Scrying. To scry is to gaze into a reflective surface, allowing the mind to relax and enter a state where visions can emerge. This practice is ancient and found in many cultures around the world, from the crystal balls of European fortune tellers to the water bowls used by seers in Africa and Asia. In Mesoamerica, obsidian mirrors were the primary tool for scrying, and the practice was highly developed, with techniques passed down from master to student through oral tradition and careful training. Scrying was not something anyone could do effectively. It required not just the right tools, but also the right state of mind, the right knowledge, and often the right bloodline or spiritual calling. The diviner would begin by creating the proper environment. Scrying was usually done in dim light, either at night or in a darkened room, because bright light made it difficult to see into the reflective surface. The area would be cleansed and purified, swept clean of any mundane objects or distractions. Incense would be burned, filling the space with smoke and fragrance, helping to shift the atmosphere from ordinary to sacred. The diviner might ring bells or shake rattles, using sound to mark the boundary between everyday reality and the ritual space they were creating. All of these preparations were important because they helped the diviner transition mentally and spiritually from their normal state of consciousness to the altered state necessary for scrying. Once the space was prepared, the diviner would sit or kneel comfortably, holding the mirror or placing it on a stand or cushion in front of them. They would spend time centering themselves, breathing slowly and deeply, quieting their thoughts, allowing the concerns of the day to drift away. This was not forced or rushed. It was a gentle process, like waiting for water to settle after it has been disturbed, allowing the surface to become still and smooth. When the diviner felt ready, they would begin to gaze into the mirror. They would not stare intensely or strain their eyes. Instead, they would let their gaze soften, looking at the surface but also through it, as if the mirror were not a solid object but a window or a doorway. At first, there would usually be nothing, just darkness, perhaps the vague reflection of the diviner's own face, shadowy and indistinct. But the diviner would continue to gaze, patient and open, waiting. After some time, which could be minutes or much longer, the darkness might begin to shift. Shapes might start to form, at first so faint and uncertain that it was hard to tell if they were real or imagined. The diviner would not grasp at these shapes or try to force them into clarity. Instead, they would simply observe, allowing the images to develop at their own pace. Sometimes the shapes would resolve into recognizable forms, people or animals or landscapes. Sometimes they remained abstract, patterns of light and shadow that suggested meaning without spelling it out clearly. The visions that came during scrying were understood to be messages, but messages that required interpretation. A diviner might see an image of a jaguar, for instance. To an untrained observer, this might mean nothing, but to the diviner, it could mean many things depending on the context. Jaguars were associated with the night, with the underworld, with power and danger. They were the animal form that gods and sorcerers could take when they traveled between worlds. If the question being asked concerned a journey or a battle, the appearance of a jaguar might be a warning of danger ahead, a suggestion that stealth and strength would be needed. If the question concerned a person's spiritual path, the jaguar might represent a call to develop inner power or to confront fears. The diviner would consider all these possibilities, drawing on their training and their intuition, before delivering an interpretation to the person who had sought their guidance. Chapter 8. The questions people asked. Why did people seek out diviners and their obsidian mirrors? What kinds of questions weighed so heavily on their hearts that they needed to peer into darkness and hope for answers? The truth is that the reasons were as varied as human life itself. In ancient Mesoamerica, as in all times and places, people faced uncertainty and feared the unknown. They wanted to make the best decisions they could, to avoid disaster, to find success and happiness. They wanted to understand their place in a world that often seemed chaotic and beyond their control. The obsidian mirror offered a way to gain some measure of insight, some glimpse of the patterns that underlay the apparent randomness of existence. One of the most common reasons people consulted diviners was to determine the right time for important actions. The Mesoamerican calendar was complex, with multiple cycles running simultaneously, and different days were considered favorable or unfavorable for different activities. There was the sacred calendar of 260 days and the solar calendar of 365 days, and these two cycles interwove in a pattern that repeated only once every 52 years. Priests were responsible for keeping track of these cycles and advising people on when to plant crops, when to hold ceremonies, when to go to war. But even beyond the formal calendar, there were questions about timing that required more specific, personalized answers. Should a merchant begin a long trading journey now or wait a few more weeks? Should a marriage be arranged this month or next? The diviner would consult the mirror, seeking visions that would help answer these questions, looking for signs of whether the path ahead was clear or filled with obstacles. People also consulted diviners when they were sick or when illness struck their family. In the worldview of ancient Mesoamerica, sickness was not just a physical problem, but often a spiritual one. It could be caused by offending a god, by breaking a taboo, by being cursed by an enemy, or by losing a part of one's soul through fright or trauma. The diviner would use the mirror to look into the spiritual dimension of the illness, trying to see what had caused it and what could be done to heal it. They might see a vision of the patient's soul wandering lost in the underworld, needing to be retrieved through ritual. They might see the face of a person who had sent harmful magic, allowing the victim to take protective measures or to seek reconciliation. The mirror allowed the diviner to see beyond symptoms to causes, to address the root of the problem rather than just its outward manifestation. Questions about the future were always popular. People wanted to know what lay ahead for them, whether they would be prosperous or poor, whether their children would thrive, whether they would live long or die young. The diviner knew that the future was not fixed, that it could be influenced by human choices and by the will of the gods, but they also believed that there were patterns and tendencies, probabilities that could be perceived by someone with the skill to look deeply enough. The visions in the mirror were not like reading a clear prediction written in stone. They were more like hints and suggestions, warnings and encouragements, meant to guide the person toward making wise choices rather than simply telling them what would happen no matter what they did. And sometimes people came to the diviner not with a specific question, but with a deep sense of unease, a feeling that something was wrong or out of balance, but not knowing what. In these cases, the diviner would use the mirror to explore the person's life and circumstances, looking for spiritual problems, for broken relationships with gods or ancestors, for signs of envy or malice from others. The mirror became a tool for diagnosis, helping to bring hidden problems into the light where they could be addressed and healed. Chapter 9. The Training of a Seer. Becoming a diviner was not a casual decision or something that could be learned quickly. It was a calling that often began in childhood, when certain signs or experiences marked a person as having the potential for sacred work. Perhaps the child saw visions without trying, or spoke prophecies they did not understand, or survived a serious illness that brought them close to death and back again. These experiences were seen as the gods reaching out, marking the child as someone who could serve as a bridge between worlds. When such a child was identified, they might be taken into training by an established priest or shaman, beginning a long apprenticeship that would last many years. The training involved learning vast amounts of knowledge. The apprentice had to memorize the sacred calendar in all its complexity, understanding the qualities and associations of each day, each month, each cycle. They had to learn the stories of the gods, the myths of creation and destruction, the tales of heroes and monsters, because all of this knowledge was necessary for interpreting visions correctly. They had to learn about plants and animals, about which ones were sacred and which were dangerous, about which could be used for healing and which for altering consciousness. They had to learn prayers and songs, the proper words to address each deity, the offerings that pleased them. All of this was transmitted orally, repeated until it was etched into memory, because writing, while it existed in some Mesoamerican cultures, was not used for this kind of detailed religious instruction. But knowledge alone was not enough. The apprentice also had to develop their spiritual sensitivity, their ability to enter altered states of consciousness, and to perceive things that were not visible to ordinary sight. This was developed through practice and through ordeals. The apprentice would fast repeatedly, going without food for days at a time, learning to ignore the complaints of the body and to focus entirely on the spiritual realm. They would go on vision quests, traveling to remote places, caves or mountaintops, and staying there alone, without food or sleep, waiting for visions to come. They would practice bloodletting, piercing their own flesh with thorns or stingray spines, learning to use the pain and the blood as offerings and as tools for focusing the mind. These were not easy experiences. They were physically and emotionally demanding, pushing the apprentice to their limits, but they were considered necessary to develop the strength and discipline needed for the work. The apprentice would also learn to work with the obsidian mirror, first simply by gazing into it regularly, becoming comfortable with the process, learning to quiet their mind and wait patiently for images to appear. At first, they might see nothing or only vague, confusing shapes. But over time, with practice and with the guidance of their teacher, the visions would become clearer and more meaningful. The teacher would help the apprentice understand what they were seeing, placing the images in context, teaching them how to distinguish between true visions sent by the gods and false images created by their own hopes or fears. This was a subtle skill, one that took years to develop fully, and even experienced diviners sometimes struggled to interpret what they saw correctly. The relationship between teacher and student was close and demanding. The teacher was not just instructing, but was also guiding the spiritual development of the apprentice, watching for signs of progress or problems, protecting the apprentice from dangers they might encounter in the spirit world. The apprentice, for their part, had to be obedient and dedicated, trusting the teacher even when the training was difficult or frightening. When the teacher finally judged that the apprentice was ready, there would be a ceremony marking their transition to full diviner status, recognizing them as someone qualified to serve the community in this sacred role. From that point forward, they would be both honored and burdened, respected for their abilities, but also held to high standards of behavior and integrity. Chapter 10. The Mirror and the Underworld. In Mesoamerican cosmology, the universe was not divided simply into earth and sky, but into multiple realms, each with its own characteristics and inhabitants. Below the earth was the underworld, a place of darkness and mystery, where the dead went on their journey after life ended. The underworld was not a single place, but a complex landscape with different regions and levels, some more dangerous than others. To reach the final resting place, the soul had to navigate this treacherous terrain, facing challenges and passing through gates guarded by fearsome beings. The obsidian mirror was connected to this underworld in profound ways, and part of its power came from its association with that dark realm. Obsidian itself was born from the earth's depths, from volcanic fire that rose up from below. It was a substance that belonged to the underworld, even though it was found on the surface. When you looked into an obsidian mirror, you were looking into darkness, into the color of night and shadow, into the visual equivalent of the underworld. It was believed that the mirror could serve as a doorway to that realm, allowing visions from the underworld to emerge into the world of the living. The gods of death and the ancestors who dwelt in the underworld could use the mirror to communicate, sending messages or warnings, showing the diviner what needed to be seen. This connection made the obsidian mirror both powerful and dangerous. The underworld was not a place to approach lightly or without preparation. It was filled with spirits that might be hostile or deceptive, eager to trick the living or to pull them down into the darkness. A diviner using the mirror had to know how to protect themselves, how to establish boundaries, how to command respect from the beings they might encounter. This was part of the training, learning the prayers and gestures that would keep the diviner safe, learning to recognize when a vision was trustworthy and when it was a trap or an illusion. Some diviners developed relationships with specific spirits or ancestors, beings who would act as guides or protectors during scrying sessions, helping to navigate the dangers of the underworld and to bring back useful information. The Maya especially emphasized this underworld connection. In their creation story, recorded in the Popol Vuh, hero twins descended into Xibalba, the Maya underworld, where they faced trials and battles against the death gods. They played ball games, solved riddles, endured torture, and eventually triumphed, though one twin died and was resurrected in the process. This story was more than entertainment. It was a template for understanding death and rebirth, for comprehending the journey that every soul would eventually have to make. The obsidian mirror was seen as a tool that allowed priests and shamans to make that journey symbolically, while still alive, descending into Xibalba through vision to gain knowledge or to retrieve lost souls, then returning safely to the world above. When a person died, mirrors were sometimes placed in their tomb, as we have mentioned before, but the reason was connected to this underworld journey. The mirror would help the deceased to navigate the darkness, providing light or reflection where there would otherwise be none. It could show them the path they needed to take, or it could serve as a shield against hostile spirits, reflecting back any attacks and keeping the soul safe. The mirror was a companion and a guide, ensuring that the dead would not be lost forever in the shadows, but would reach their proper destination and eventually, perhaps, be reborn. Chapter 11. Tezcatlipoca and the Smoking Mirror. No discussion of obsidian mirrors in ancient Mesoamerica would be complete without giving more attention to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror god, whose very identity was bound up with this sacred object. Tezcatlipoca was one of the most complex and multifaceted deities in the Aztec pantheon, a god who embodied contradictions and mysteries, who could be both benevolent and cruel, both creative and destructive. He was the eternal rival and counterpart of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and their conflict and cooperation shaped the history of the cosmos in Aztec mythology. According to the myths, Tezcatlipoca lost his foot in the creation of the world. In some versions of the story, he and Quetzalcoatl transformed themselves into serpents and tore apart the great earth monster, a massive creature that floated in the primordial waters. From her body, they created the earth, the mountains, the rivers, and the valleys. But in the violent struggle, Tezcatlipoca's foot was torn off, bitten away by the monster in her death throes. In place of his missing foot, he wore a smoking obsidian mirror, a symbol of his sacrifice and his power. This mirror was not just a prosthetic or a badge of his injury. It was a source of his strength, a tool through which he could see everything that happened in the world, through which he could peer into hearts and minds, knowing the secrets that people try to hide. Tezcatlipoca was the god of fate and fortune, the one who could change a person's destiny in an instant. He was capricious, unpredictable, favoring someone one moment and withdrawing his favor the next, often for reasons that seemed arbitrary or impossible to understand. This made him frightening, because no matter how virtuous or careful you were, you could never be certain of his goodwill. He was particularly associated with rulers and warriors, with those who held power and who had to make difficult decisions. Rulers were expected to consult Tezcatlipoca to seek his guidance through prayers and through divination with obsidian mirrors, because he was the ultimate authority on matters of leadership and strategy. The priests of Tezcatlipoca were among the most important and respected in Aztec society. They underwent intense training and rigorous discipline, including long periods of fasting and celibacy, demonstrating their devotion and their willingness to sacrifice comfort for spiritual power. These priests were the primary keepers and users of obsidian mirrors for divination. They would perform ceremonies on behalf of the ruler, asking Tezcatlipoca what should be done about an enemy, whether the timing was right for a military campaign, what offerings were needed to ensure success. The god's answers would come through visions in the mirror, and the priests had to interpret those visions carefully, because misunderstanding Tezcatlipoca's message could lead to disaster. Tezcatlipoca was also closely associated with sorcery and magic, particularly the darker forms of magic that involved cursing or harming others. He was the patron of those who worked spells in secret, and this added another layer to the symbolism of the smoking mirror. The mirror was a tool not just for seeing but for acting, for projecting power across distance, for affecting people without touching them. A sorcerer with an obsidian mirror could, it was believed, send their vision into someone else's home, seeing what they were doing, even invading their dreams. They could focus their will through the mirror, directing curses or blessings, manipulating events from afar. This made mirrors objects of both great utility and great fear, respected and handled with extreme caution. Chapter 12. Mirrors and Political Power. In the hierarchical societies of ancient Mesoamerica, religion and politics were inseparable. Rulers were not just secular leaders, but were seen as semi-divine figures, intermediaries between the human world and the realm of the gods. Their authority came not just from military might or economic control, but from their spiritual legitimacy, their ability to communicate with and please the gods, ensuring that the rains came, the crops grew, and enemies were defeated. The obsidian mirror was one of the key symbols and tools of this spiritual authority, and control over mirrors and the diviners who used them was an important element of political power. Rulers often owned multiple obsidian mirrors, some of them quite large and elaborately decorated, set into frames of precious wood or stone, adorned with feathers and jade. These mirrors were kept in palaces and temples, treated as treasures of the state. They were not used casually, but brought out for important ceremonies and consultations. When a ruler needed to make a major decision, such as whether to go to war or how to respond to a natural disaster, they would consult with their priests and diviners, who would use the mirrors to seek guidance from the gods. The results of these consultations could determine the course of history, leading to invasions, alliances, building projects, or religious reforms. The control of obsidian sources was also politically significant. Since obsidian was essential for making mirrors as well as for tools and weapons, the regions where it could be mined were valuable and often contested. Rulers who controlled obsidian quarries had access to wealth and to a strategic resource. They could trade obsidian for other goods, building alliances and extending their influence. They could ensure that their own priests and warriors had the best quality obsidian, giving them advantages in spiritual and military endeavors. Wars were sometimes fought over access to obsidian, and trade routes carrying obsidian were carefully protected and controlled. There are also accounts, preserved in the historical records from after the Spanish conquest, of mirrors being used in diplomatic contexts. When emissaries from one city-state visited another, gifts were exchanged, and obsidian mirrors were among the most prestigious and meaningful gifts that could be given. To present someone with a finely crafted obsidian mirror was to acknowledge their importance and to create or strengthen a relationship. It was a gift that carried spiritual as well as material value, implying that the recipient was worthy of possessing such a powerful object. At the same time, accepting such a gift created obligations, binding the recipient to certain expectations of reciprocity and alliance. The Spanish conquistadors, when they arrived in the early 16th century, were both fascinated and disturbed by the obsidian mirrors they encountered. They recognized that these objects were important, but they often misunderstood or misrepresented their significance. Some Spanish accounts describe the mirrors as tools of devil worship, objects through which demons spoke to the indigenous priests. These accounts tell us more about Spanish fears and prejudices than about the actual use of the mirrors, but they also indicate how central the mirrors were to Mesoamerican religious practice. The Spanish made efforts to destroy mirrors along with other religious objects, seeing them as obstacles to the conversion of the indigenous people to Christianity. Many mirrors were smashed or buried, and the knowledge of how to make and use them began to fade as the old religious systems were suppressed. Chapter 13: The Arrival of the Spanish and the Fate of the Mirrors. The year 1519 marked a turning point in the history of Mesoamerica when Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Mexico and began their march inland toward the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The arrival of these strangers, with their horses and steel weapons and guns, was shocking and terrifying to the people who encountered them. According to some accounts, the Aztec ruler Moctezuma consulted his diviners and their obsidian mirrors, trying to understand who these newcomers were and what their arrival meant. The visions that came were troubling and unclear, filled with images of destruction and chaos. Some sources say that the mirrors showed temples burning and cities falling, warnings of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Moctezuma reportedly sent gifts to Cortés, hoping to either appease him or to discourage him from continuing his advance. Among these gifts were magnificent works of art, objects made of gold and feathers and precious stones, and some sources suggest that obsidian mirrors were included as well. If this is true, then these mirrors were among the first Mesoamerican sacred objects to reach Europe, carried back by the conquistadors as curiosities and trophies. The Spanish did not understand the spiritual significance of the mirrors. To them, they were simply polished stones, interesting because of their reflective quality but nothing more. The knowledge of how they were used, the rituals and prayers and visions associated with them, did not travel with the physical objects. The conquest was brutal and devastating. Tenochtitlan was besieged and eventually fell in 1521 after months of fighting and starvation. The temples were destroyed, their stones used to build Christian churches. Priests and nobles were killed or fled into hiding. The old religious practices were forbidden, replaced by Catholicism, often enforced through violence and intimidation. The obsidian mirrors, along with other sacred objects, were systematically sought out and destroyed by Spanish priests who saw them as idolatrous and demonic. Bonfires were lit in public squares, and into these fires went codices filled with ancient knowledge, statues of gods, ritual costumes, and mirrors. The smoke rose into the sky, carrying away centuries of accumulated wisdom and tradition. But not everything was destroyed. Some objects survived, hidden away by people who refused to abandon their old ways entirely, or preserved accidentally, buried in places that the Spanish never searched. Some mirrors ended up in the hands of collectors or were sent back to Europe as exotic artifacts, eventually finding their way into museums where they were cataloged and stored, often without any real understanding of what they had been used for. Indigenous people continued to practice some of their old rituals in secret, blending them with Christian elements to create syncretic traditions that could survive under Spanish rule. The use of mirrors for divination did not disappear entirely, though it became much rarer and more hidden, practiced only by those willing to risk punishment. Over time, as generations passed and the old ways faded from living memory, the obsidian mirrors became historical objects rather than living tools. Archaeologists began to uncover them in tombs and buried caches, recognizing their importance, but often unable to fully understand their original use. Scholars studied the mirrors, measuring them, analyzing the techniques used to make them, speculating about their function. Indigenous communities retained some knowledge, though it was fragmented and mixed with other traditions. The mirrors had become artifacts, relics of a lost world, silent witnesses to practices and beliefs that had once been central to entire civilizations. Chapter 14: Mirrors in the Hands of Archaeologists. When archaeologists began to systematically study the ancient cultures of Mesoamerica in the 19th and 20th centuries, they encountered obsidian mirrors in various contexts. The mirrors were found in royal tombs, placed alongside the bodies of kings and queens. They were found in temple caches, buried beneath stone floors as offerings to gods. They were found in the ruins of palaces, sometimes broken into fragments, sometimes still intact. Each discovery added to the growing understanding of how important these objects had been, but it also raised questions. What exactly had people seen when they looked into these mirrors? How were they used in rituals? What training and knowledge was required to use them effectively? One of the most famous obsidian mirrors in the world is now housed in the British Museum in London. This particular mirror has a fascinating history that connects ancient Mesoamerica to Renaissance Europe in an unexpected way. The mirror is circular, highly polished, made from a single piece of obsidian. On the back, it has been set into a frame decorated with Aztec imagery. For many years, this mirror was believed to have belonged to Dr. John Dee, an English mathematician, astrologer, and occultist who served as an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I in the late 1500s. Dee was interested in scrying and claimed to communicate with angels through the use of reflective surfaces. He owned several scrying mirrors, and this obsidian mirror was thought to be one of them. Recent research has suggested that the mirror probably did come from Mexico, brought back by Spanish conquistadors, and that it somehow made its way into Dee's possession, perhaps through gift or purchase. Dee would not have understood its original Mesoamerican context or significance. He would have used it according to his own European magical traditions, gazing into it to seek visions and messages from supernatural beings. In a strange twist of history, the mirror that had once been used by Aztec priests to communicate with Tezcatlipoca or other Mesoamerican deities was being used by an English scholar to speak with what he believed were Christian angels. The mirror had traveled across an ocean and across cultures, its meaning transformed, but its function remaining essentially the same, a tool for seeing beyond the ordinary world. Archaeologists studying obsidian mirrors have used modern technology to learn more about how they were made and used. By examining the microscopic traces left on the polished surfaces, researchers can determine what materials were used for polishing and how long the process must have taken. They can identify the specific volcanic sources from which the obsidian came, tracing ancient trade networks across hundreds of miles. They can sometimes even find residues of organic materials on the mirrors, traces of the incense or the blood that was offered during rituals. All of this scientific analysis helps to fill in the gaps in our knowledge, providing concrete details that complement the descriptions found in historical documents and oral traditions. But there remains much that we do not, and perhaps cannot know. We can measure and analyze the physical mirrors, but we cannot fully access the subjective experience of the diviners who use them. We can read descriptions of visions, but we cannot see through their eyes or feel what they felt. We can study the religious texts and myths, but the lived reality of belief and practice always exceeds what can be captured in words or artifacts. The mirrors remain mysterious, holding their secrets, offering glimpses into the past, but never revealing everything. Chapter 15. The symbolic meaning of the mirror. Beyond their practical use as tools for divination, obsidian mirrors carry deep symbolic meanings in Mesoamerican thought. A mirror is, by its nature, a paradoxical object. It shows you yourself, but reversed, a double that is both you and not you. It reflects the world around it, but that reflection is not the same as the reality it depicts. It is an image, a representation, something that exists on the border between the real and the unreal. For ancient Mesoamerican philosophers and priests, these qualities made the mirror a perfect symbol for thinking about the nature of reality, perception, and the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. The mirror represented the idea of duality, which was central to Mesoamerican cosmology. The universe was understood to be made up of opposing but complementary forces: light and darkness, life and death, order and chaos, masculine and feminine. These forces were not in conflict but rather in balance, each necessary for the existence of the other. The mirror, showing both the thing and its reflection, both reality and image, embodied this duality. It was a reminder that what we see on the surface is not the whole truth, that there are always deeper layers, hidden dimensions that require special tools or knowledge to perceive. The mirror also represented self-knowledge and introspection. To look into a mirror is to confront yourself, to see your own face, your own expression, your own reality reflected back. This could be unsettling, forcing you to see yourself as others see you, making you aware of aspects of yourself that you might prefer to ignore. The Aztec believed that the obsidian mirror could reveal not just your outer appearance, but your inner nature, your true character, the contents of your heart. The god Tezcatlipoca, with his all-seeing mirror, knew every thought, every secret, every hidden intention. Nothing could be concealed from him. To stand before his mirror was to stand before judgment, to have everything about you laid bare and evaluated. At the same time, the mirror represented mystery and the unknown. When you gazed into an obsidian mirror in a dark room, what you saw was not your clear reflection, but something more ambiguous: shadowy shapes, moving forms, images that came from somewhere beyond yourself. The mirror was a window into the realm of the gods and spirits, a place where the rules of ordinary reality did not apply. It was a threshold, a place of crossing over, and as such, it was both alluring and dangerous. To use the mirror was to venture into unknown territory, to seek knowledge that was not freely given, to risk encountering things that might be better left unseen. The reflective surface of the mirror was also associated with water, another substance that reflects images and that was deeply sacred in Mesoamerican cultures. Water was essential for life, the source of growth and fertility, but it was also associated with the underworld, with rain coming from below the earth, with caves and cenotes that opened into dark, water-filled depths. Mirrors and water were seen as related phenomena, both capable of showing things that were not immediately present, both serving as portals to other realms. In some rituals, divination was performed by gazing into bowls of water instead of or in addition to using obsidian mirrors, and the two methods were understood to be working on similar principles. Chapter 16. Mirrors and the Soul. In Mesoamerican belief systems, the human being was not a simple unity, but a complex composite of different elements. There was the physical body, of course, but there were also multiple souls or spiritual essences, each with its own nature and function. The Aztecs spoke of the teolia, the soul located in the heart, which provided life force and awareness. They spoke of the hyadal, the soul associated with breath and the liver, which gave energy and passion. And they spoke of the tonali, a soul connected to the head and to one's day of birth, which determined personality and fate. These different souls could become separated from the body, either temporarily or permanently, and this could cause illness, madness, or death. The obsidian mirror was believed to have a special relationship with the soul, particularly with the tonali. The tonali was associated with heat and light, with the sun and with fire, and it could be strengthened or weakened by various circumstances. When someone suffered a fright or a traumatic experience, their tonali could escape, fleeing from the body and leaving the person weak and vulnerable. Children were especially susceptible to this kind of soul loss. If a child became chronically ill or listless, a healer might use an obsidian mirror to locate the lost tonali, gazing into the reflective surface and seeing where the soul had gone, whether it was wandering lost in the forest, or trapped in the underworld, or held captive by a malevolent spirit. Once the location was determined, the healer could perform a ritual to retrieve the soul and restore it to the body, bringing the person back to health. The mirror was also used in rituals designed to strengthen the tonali, to fill it with energy and light so that the person would be vigorous and fortunate. These rituals often involved placing a small obsidian mirror on the top of a person's head, the location where the tonali was thought to enter and exit the body. The mirror would be blessed and charged with power through prayers and offerings, then placed on the head while sacred words were spoken, sealing the tonali within the body and protecting it from being stolen or lost. This was particularly important for rulers and warriors who needed strong tonali to be successful in their demanding roles. Conversely, mirrors could be used in harmful magic to attack someone's soul. A sorcerer with malicious intent could use an obsidian mirror to locate a person's tonali and then attempt to damage or capture it, causing that person to sicken or to suffer misfortune. This was one reason why mirrors were both respected and feared. They were tools that could be used for healing and protection, but in the wrong hands, they could become weapons. People had to be careful about who knew their true name or who had access to their personal possessions, because these things could be used in conjunction with a mirror to target them spiritually. Protective rituals and amulets were employed to guard against such attacks, creating spiritual shields that would deflect or absorb harmful magic sent through mirrors or other means. The connection between mirrors and the soul extended even to the afterlife. As we have discussed, mirrors were placed in tombs to help the deceased navigate the underworld, but they also served another purpose. It was believed that the souls of the dead could use mirrors to look back at the world of the living, to see their descendants, to watch over their families. In this way, the mirror became a means of maintaining connection between the living and the dead, a bridge that allowed for communication and mutual care even after the ultimate separation of death. Chapter 17. The Colonial Period and Syncretic Survival. After the initial shock and devastation of the Spanish conquest, the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica faced a long and difficult process of adaptation and survival under colonial rule. Their populations had been decimated by warfare and by diseases brought from Europe, against which they had no immunity. Their social and political structures had been dismantled and replaced with Spanish colonial administration. Their religions were officially suppressed, with Catholic churches built on the ruins of their temples and Spanish priests working to convert everyone to Christianity. Yet despite all of this pressure and violence, many aspects of the old ways persisted, sometimes openly, more often in hidden or transformed ways. The practice of divination with obsidian mirrors did not disappear entirely, though it became much less common and much more dangerous. Indigenous healers and wise people, often called curanderos or curandras, continued to serve their communities, providing medical treatment and spiritual guidance. Some of these healers had been trained in pre-conquest traditions or had learned from elders who maintained that knowledge. They continued to use traditional methods, including divination, though they had to be careful about how openly they practiced. If the Spanish authorities discovered someone using what they considered to be pagan or magical practices, that person could be arrested, tried by the Inquisition, and punished, sometimes severely. To survive, many indigenous practices became syncretic, blending with Catholic elements in ways that allowed them to continue while appearing more acceptable to the Spanish. Healers might perform a divination ritual but include prayers to Catholic saints or the Virgin Mary. They might use an obsidian mirror but also burn candles blessed by a Catholic priest. This blending was not just strategic or superficial. Over time, genuine fusion occurred, creating new forms of religious expression that combined indigenous and European elements into something unique. The obsidian mirror, if it was used at all, was often reinterpreted within this hybrid framework, becoming a tool for discerning the will of Christian God or for communicating with saints rather than with the old gods. Written records from the colonial period occasionally mention mirrors in the context of Inquisition trials. Indigenous people accused of witchcraft or idolatry were interrogated about their practices, and sometimes they testified about using mirrors to see hidden things or to cast spells. These testimonies give us glimpses into how mirrors were being used in the colonial period, though we have to be careful about interpreting them, because the testimony was often extracted under duress and filtered through the understanding and biases of the Spanish priests who recorded it. Still, these documents show that mirrors retained some of their power and meaning even in this transformed context, that they were still seen as objects capable of revealing secrets and affecting events. In remote regions, far from Spanish centers of control, indigenous communities were sometimes able to maintain more of their traditional practices with less interference. In these places, the use of obsidian mirrors and other forms of divination continued more openly, passed down from generation to generation as part of an unbroken tradition. Even today, in some indigenous communities in Mexico and Central America, there are healers and spiritual practitioners who use techniques that can be traced back to pre-conquest origins, though the practices have inevitably evolved and changed over the centuries. Some of these practitioners still use obsidian or other reflective surfaces as tools in their work, carrying forward a tradition that is thousands of years old. Chapter 18: Rediscovery and Modern Scholarship. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Mexico and other Latin American countries gained independence from Spain and began to develop their own national identities, there was a renewed interest in pre-conquest indigenous cultures. Scholars began to study the archaeological sites and the surviving documents with fresh eyes, seeking to understand these ancient civilizations not as primitive curiosities, but as sophisticated societies with their own complex philosophies, technologies, and artistic traditions. Obsidian mirrors became objects of particular interest, recognized as important artifacts that could tell us much about Mesoamerican religion and worldview. Anthropologists and ethnographers working with contemporary indigenous communities documented practices that still showed connections to the ancient past. They recorded stories and beliefs about mirrors, about divination, about the spirit world. They observed healers at work, with permission, and wrote descriptions of the rituals and techniques they used. This ethnographic work provided valuable context for understanding the archaeological finds, showing how ancient practices might have been performed and what they might have meant to the people who practiced them. Of course, this work had to be done carefully and respectfully, with awareness that these were not dead traditions being examined like museum specimens, but living practices that belonged to real communities with the right to privacy and self-determination. Art historians and archaeologists analyzed the depictions of mirrors in ancient Mesoamerican art, looking at the carved reliefs on temple walls, the painted scenes in codices, the designs on pottery. They found that mirrors appeared again and again in contexts associated with rulers, priests, and gods, confirming their importance. They noticed that mirrors were often shown on the forehead, chest, or back of important figures, positioned at key points on the body that were believed to be spiritually significant. They studied the iconography surrounding the mirrors, the symbols and images that appeared alongside them, building up a detailed picture of how mirrors fit into the broader religious and symbolic system. Scientific analysis of obsidian mirrors has revealed fascinating details. Researchers have used techniques like X-ray fluorescence to determine the chemical composition of the obsidian, which acts like a fingerprint, identifying exactly which volcanic source the stone came from. This has allowed them to map ancient trade networks with precision, showing that obsidian from certain quarries was transported hundreds of miles and prized for its particular qualities. They have examined the wear patterns on mirrors, looking for evidence of how they were used, whether they were held in hands or mounted in frames, whether they were used frequently or kept as treasured heirlooms. Every detail adds to our understanding. Experimental archaeologists have even tried to recreate the process of making obsidian mirrors, using only the tools and techniques that would have been available in ancient times. This work is painstaking and requires enormous patience, just as it did for the original craftspeople. Through these experiments, researchers have gained deep appreciation for the skill and dedication required to create these objects, and they have learned details about the manufacturing process that could not be determined from examining finished mirrors alone. This kind of hands-on research brings us closer to the experience of the ancient craftspeople, helping to bridge the gap between past and present. Chapter 19. The Mirror in Popular Imagination. In the centuries since the conquest, obsidian mirrors and the cultures that created them have captured the popular imagination in various ways, often becoming surrounded by myths and misunderstandings. In the 19th century, as European and American interest in the exotic and the occult grew, Mesoamerican artifacts, including obsidian mirrors, began to appear in private collections and museums. These objects were often presented as mysterious and vaguely sinister, relics of civilizations that practiced human sacrifice and worshipped alien gods. This sensationalized view told us more about Victorian anxieties and fascinations than about the actual cultures that made the mirrors, but it helped to keep interest in these objects alive. The story of John Dee's mirror, mentioned earlier, contributed to the mystique. Dee was a fascinating figure, a scholar who straddled the line between science and magic in an era when that line was not clearly drawn. His attempts to communicate with angels through scrying made him both famous and controversial, and the idea that he might have used an authentic Aztec mirror added an extra layer of exoticism to his story. Books and articles about Dee often featured his obsidian mirror prominently, and reproductions of the mirror became popular among modern practitioners of ceremonial magic and occultism. In Mexico, the obsidian mirror and figures like Tezcatlipoca have been reclaimed as symbols of indigenous heritage and national identity. Artists, writers, and intellectuals have drawn on pre-conquest imagery and mythology, reimagining it for contemporary audiences. The obsidian mirror appears in novels, in paintings, in films, usually as a symbol of ancient wisdom or supernatural power. Sometimes these representations are historically informed, drawing on scholarly research to create authentic and respectful portrayals. Other times they are more fantastical, using the mirror as a plot device or visual motif, without much concern for historical accuracy. Both approaches have value, the former for education and cultural preservation, the latter for keeping the imagery alive in popular culture and inspiring people to learn more. The concept of the obsidian mirror has also found its way into discussions of psychology and philosophy. The idea of the mirror as a tool for self-examination, for confronting hidden aspects of oneself, resonates with modern psychological concepts about the unconscious mind and shadow self. Some writers have drawn parallels between ancient Mesoamerican scrying practices and modern techniques like meditation, visualization, or therapy, suggesting that despite vast differences in cultural context, humans across time have developed similar methods for exploring inner experience and seeking insight. These comparisons can be illuminating, though they also risk oversimplifying or appropriating indigenous practices in ways that strip them of their specific cultural meanings. In recent years, there has been growing awareness of the need to approach indigenous artifacts and traditions with respect and to recognize the rights of indigenous communities to control their own cultural heritage. Museums have begun to work more collaboratively with indigenous groups, consulting with them about how artifacts should be displayed and interpreted, sometimes even returning objects to their communities of origin. The obsidian mirrors in museum collections are no longer just objects to be studied by outsiders, but are increasingly recognized as having ongoing significance for the descendants of the people who made them, as living links to ancestral knowledge and identity. Chapter 20. The Science of Scrying and Altered States. From a modern scientific perspective, the practice of scrying with obsidian mirrors is fascinating because it involves altered states of consciousness and the psychology of perception. When someone gazes into a reflective surface for an extended period, particularly in dim light, several things happen. The eyes begin to strain and tire. The visual system, which is constantly looking for patterns and meaning, starts to interpret the small variations in the surface or in the ambient light as shapes and forms. The mind, in a relaxed and receptive state, becomes more open to imagination and to unconscious material surfacing. All of these factors can combine to produce genuine visual experiences, subjective but real to the person experiencing them. Neuroscience research on meditation and trance states has shown that these altered states of consciousness involve measurable changes in brain activity. Regions of the brain associated with focused attention become more active, while regions associated with a sense of self and with critical, analytical thinking become less active. This shift allows for different kinds of mental processing, more intuitive and associative rather than logical and linear. In this state, people can have insights and experiences that feel profound and meaningful, accessing parts of their mind that are usually not available to conscious awareness. The ancient Mesoamerican diviners, through their training and practices, were cultivating precisely these kinds of altered states, using the obsidian mirror as a focus point and a trigger. The use of fasting, bloodletting, and plant medicines in conjunction with scrying served to deepen these altered states. Fasting changes blood sugar levels and affects brain chemistry, making the mind more susceptible to visions and unusual experiences. Bloodletting causes pain, which can induce a kind of trance, and blood loss can lead to lightheadedness and altered perception. Various plants used in Mesoamerican rituals, including psilocybin mushrooms, morning glory seeds, and others, contain compounds that directly affect brain chemistry, producing powerful hallucinogenic experiences. When all of these factors were combined with prolonged gazing into an obsidian mirror in a darkened, incense-filled space, with the expectation and intention of receiving visions, it is not surprising that people had profound experiences. Does this scientific understanding diminish the spiritual significance of scrying? Not necessarily. Understanding the mechanisms through which something occurs does not negate the meaning or value of the experience. For the ancient Mesoamericans, the visions that came during scrying were real communications from gods and spirits, and the rituals were effective ways to access important information and power. From a modern perspective, we might describe the same experiences differently, talking about the unconscious mind, about symbolic thinking, about the brain's capacity to generate imagery and insight. Both descriptions can be valid, operating at different levels of explanation, addressing different kinds of questions. What is clear is that the obsidian mirror was a powerful psychological tool, one that could facilitate deep introspection, creative problem-solving, and access to parts of the self that were usually hidden. The diviners who used these mirrors were, in a sense, ancient psychologists and counselors, helping people to understand themselves and their situations more deeply, providing guidance and reassurance in times of uncertainty. The fact that they understood their work in religious rather than psychological terms does not change the reality that they were addressing fundamental human needs, the need for meaning, for direction, for connection to something larger than oneself. Chapter 21. Mirrors, Cosmology, and the Nature of Reality. The obsidian mirror, in Mesoamerican thought, was more than just a tool. It was a symbol and an embodiment of a particular way of understanding reality. The Aztec and Maya, like many ancient cultures, did not make a sharp distinction between the material and spiritual worlds, between the natural and supernatural. Instead, they saw reality as layered and interpenetrating, with visible and invisible aspects that were equally real and equally important. The obsidian mirror existed at the intersection of these aspects, being both a physical object, a piece of volcanic glass, and a spiritual tool, a gateway to other realms. This understanding of reality was fundamentally different from the worldview that has dominated Western thought for the last several centuries, which tends to separate matter from spirit, objective from subjective, real from imaginary. In the Mesoamerican view, these categories were not so rigidly separated. A vision seen in a mirror was not less real than a mountain or a river. It was a different kind of reality, requiring different modes of perception, but it was nonetheless part of the total fabric of existence. The gods were not abstract concepts or distant beings, but active presences that could be encountered and interacted with through the proper techniques and in the proper state of mind. The concept of the Nawal, which appears in various Mesoamerican cultures, is relevant here. The Nawal was a person's animal double or spiritual counterpart, a being that existed in the spirit world and was connected to the person's fate and nature. Powerful individuals, especially priests and sorcerers, could transform into their Nawal form, traveling in the spirit world while their physical body remained behind. The Obsidian mirror was sometimes used to see one's Nawal or to observe others in their Nawal form, revealing hidden aspects of identity and power. This again illustrates the fluid boundary between different states of being, the way that a person could be both human and animal, both physical and spiritual, both here and somewhere else, depending on context and on modes of perception. The Mesoamerican calendar system, with its complex interlocking cycles, reflected a view of time that was also different from modern linear time. Time was seen as cyclical, with patterns that repeated, though never exactly the same way twice. The future was not completely unknown and unpredictable, but could be anticipated to some degree by understanding these cycles and patterns. Divination with obsidian mirrors was a way to perceive these patterns, to see where the current moment fit within the larger cycles, to anticipate what was likely to come next. The diviner was reading the structure of time itself, the cosmic patterns that underlay the apparent chaos of events. This cosmological framework gave the obsidian mirror its significance and power. It was not a random piece of polished stone, but a precisely crafted tool designed to work within a specific understanding of how the universe functioned. The mirror was effective because it aligned with the principles that governed reality as the Mesoamericans understood it. It was a technology, in the broadest sense, an application of knowledge to achieve practical results. The fact that the knowledge was spiritual and the results were visions does not make it any less a technology, any less a testament to human ingenuity and the desire to understand and influence the world. Chapter 22. The Legacy Today. What is the legacy of the obsidian mirror today? In one sense, it remains with us in the beautiful artifacts preserved in museums, in the detailed scholarly studies that continue to deepen our understanding, in the ongoing traditions of indigenous communities who maintain connections to their ancestral practices. In another sense, the legacy is more abstract, a reminder of different ways of seeing and knowing, of approaches to reality that challenge our modern assumptions and invite us to consider possibilities we might otherwise overlook. For many people today, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, there is a growing appreciation for the wisdom embedded in traditional knowledge systems. The Mesoamerican understanding of the interconnection between all things, between humans and nature, between the physical and spiritual dimensions of existence, resonates with contemporary concerns about ecology, sustainability, and holistic approaches to health and well-being. While we should be cautious about appropriating or romanticizing indigenous traditions, there is value in learning from them, in recognizing that other cultures have developed sophisticated and effective ways of addressing perennial human questions. The obsidian mirror also serves as a powerful metaphor for our time. We live in an age of screens, of devices that reflect images back to us, that show us representations of reality that are both true and constructed. We spend hours each day gazing into these modern mirrors, smartphones and computers and televisions, seeking information, connection, entertainment, sometimes insight. In some ways, we are not so different from the ancient diviners staring into polished obsidian, looking for patterns and meanings, hoping to understand ourselves and our world more clearly. The tools have changed, but the fundamental human drives, curiosity, and the search for meaning remain constant. There is also something to be said for the obsidian mirror as a reminder of humility and mystery. Despite all our scientific advances, Despite all the knowledge we have accumulated, there remain aspects of existence that are difficult to explain or fully understand. Consciousness itself is still deeply mysterious. The nature of time, the possibility of other dimensions or realms, the question of what happens after death, these are questions that science has not definitively answered and may never fully answer. The ancient Mesoamericans approached these mysteries through ritual and symbol, through the obsidian mirror and other sacred tools, seeking experiential knowledge rather than abstract theories. Their approach was different from ours, but not necessarily inferior, and it reminds us that there are multiple valid ways to engage with the great mysteries of existence. For those who study history and archaeology, the obsidian mirror is a fascinating artifact that opens windows into past worlds, allowing us to glimpse how people thought and lived in times and places very different from our own. Each mirror that is found and studied adds to the larger picture, helping us to understand the development of civilizations, the spread of ideas, the ways that humans have always sought to transcend the limits of ordinary perception and connect with something greater than themselves. The mirrors are silent teachers, requiring us to ask questions, to piece together evidence, to imagine what we cannot directly observe. And finally, for anyone who values beauty and craftsmanship, the obsidian mirrors are simply stunning objects. The skill required to create them, the patience and dedication, the aesthetic sensibility that guided their makers, all of this is worthy of admiration. To hold an obsidian mirror, to turn it in your hands and watch the light play across its surface, to see your own face reflected in stone that was formed in volcanic fire thousands of years ago, this is an experience that connects us directly to the past, to the hands that shaped this object and the eyes that gazed into it long ago. Chapter 23: Reflections on Vision and Seeing. As we come near the end of this long journey through the story of obsidian mirrors in ancient Mesoamerica, it is worth reflecting on the themes that have emerged again and again: vision and seeing, reflection and reality, the desire to know what is hidden. These are universal human concerns, but they were expressed in specific and culturally unique ways by the peoples of Mesoamerica, and the obsidian mirror was at the heart of how they approached these questions. Seeing in Mesoamerican thought was not passive. It was an active engagement with the world, a way of connecting and understanding. To see clearly was not just a matter of having good eyesight, but of having insight, wisdom, spiritual awareness. The obsidian mirror enhanced seeing in this deeper sense. It allowed the seer to perceive things that were present but not visible in the ordinary way, to see through surfaces to deeper truths, to see across distances, and even across time. This power of vision was both a gift and a responsibility, requiring training and ethical grounding to use well. The mirror as a metaphor suggests that reality itself might be more complex than it appears, that what we think of as solid and real might be, in some sense, a reflection, an image projected from a deeper source. Philosophers in many traditions have explored this idea, from Plato's allegory of the cave to Buddhist teachings about Maya or illusion. The Mesoamericans, gazing into their obsidian mirrors, were engaging with similar concepts, recognizing that perception is mediated, that we never see things directly as they are, but always through the filters of our senses, our minds, our cultural assumptions. The mirror made this mediation visible and explicit, showing reflection as reflection, making us aware of the gap between image and reality. Yet the mirror also bridged that gap, offering a way to see more truly by seeing differently. By entering an altered state of consciousness, by opening to visions and symbolic communications, the diviner could access knowledge that was not available through ordinary seeing and thinking. This is a profound insight that sometimes we need to look beyond the surface, to use different modes of perception, to be receptive to information that comes in unexpected forms. The obsidian mirror taught this lesson, serving as a practical tool and as a philosophical teaching all at once. In our modern world, we often privilege certain kinds of knowledge over others. We value scientific data, logical reasoning, empirical evidence. These are powerful and important tools for understanding reality. But the tradition of the obsidian mirror reminds us that there are other kinds of knowing as well. Intuitive knowing, experiential knowing, knowing that comes through symbol and story and vision. These ways of knowing are not opposed to science, but complementary to it, addressing different aspects of human experience, answering different kinds of questions. A complete understanding of ourselves and our world requires both the analytical and the intuitive, the measured and the mysterious. The ancient diviners understood this. They were not anti-intellectual or irrational. They were rigorous in their training, disciplined in their practice, careful in their interpretations. But they also knew that rationality alone was not enough, that there were dimensions of existence that required different approaches. The Obsidian mirror was the tool they developed for navigating those dimensions, for seeing what could not be seen with eyes alone, for touching the edges of the unknown and bringing back insights that could guide and heal and transform. Conclusion: the mirror's final reflection. And so we come to rest at the end of this story, though like any good story, it does not truly end but continues to unfold in new ways with each person who encounters it. The Obsidian mirror, born from volcanic fire, shaped by patient hands, polished until it gleamed with dark light, held secrets and reflected truths for countless generations of Mesoamerican people. It was a tool for speaking with gods, for finding lost souls, for glimpsing the future, for understanding fate. It was a symbol of power and wisdom, of the thin boundary between worlds, of the mysteries that lie beneath the surface of ordinary life. The great civilizations that created and used these mirrors have long since fallen. Their cities are ruins, their languages mostly silent, their rituals no longer performed in the old ways. But the mirrors themselves survive, scattered across museums and collections, silent witnesses to a world that was. They remind us that human beings have always sought to see beyond the immediate, to connect with something larger than themselves, to find meaning in a universe that can seem vast and indifferent. The Mesoamerican approach to these questions was unique, shaped by their particular history, environment, and culture, but the questions themselves are timeless. When you look at an obsidian mirror today, whether in a museum case or in a photograph, take a moment to imagine the hands that made it, the eyes that looked into it, the visions that emerged from its darkness. Imagine the priest climbing the temple steps at dawn, the mirror held carefully, reflecting the first light of the sun. Imagine the healer in a small village, gazing into the mirror's depths, searching for a lost soul, speaking words of power and healing. Imagine the ruler in a grand palace, seeking guidance before battle, hoping that the gods would show favor. All of these moments are gone, but they are also preserved in the mirror, in the object itself, and in the stories we tell about it. The obsidian mirror teaches us about seeing, about reflection, about the courage required to look into darkness and wait for what emerges. It teaches us that tools can be sacred, that the material and spiritual are not separate but intertwined, that human ingenuity can create bridges between worlds. It teaches us humility before mystery, respect for other ways of knowing, appreciation for the depth and complexity of cultures that developed far from our own. As you drift now towards sleep, let these images settle gently in your mind. The black mirror, smooth and cool. The smoke of copal incense rising. The quiet voice of the diviner, speaking words in a language ancient and strange. The visions forming and dissolving, shapes in darkness, messages from beyond. All of this happened in a world that was real and is now memory, in a time that was present and is now past. But the mirror remains, holding its secrets, waiting patiently for someone to look into its depths and see. Rest now, knowing that the human story is long and varied, that people in every time and place have sought wisdom and meaning, that we are part of a continuous thread stretching back through the centuries, connecting us to those who came before. The obsidian mirror, dark and gleaming, reflects this connection, showing us not just our own faces, but the faces of all who have ever gazed into mystery and wondered. Sleep well, and let your dreams be filled with visions as profound and beautiful as those that once emerged from volcanic glass, polished by careful hands, held up to catch the light of distant stars.